Hi KRB teachers, welcome to week 3 of the Maximinds Mental Healthcare webinar series for KRB. This week we are looking at warning signs and identifying those behaviours in class. A reminder that the content we will talk about does mention at times mental illness and suicide, and it may cause harm, distress or be traumatising to you. If that's the case, please feel free to stop at any time or reach out to me for further support. A reminder of the overview of the 8-week webinar series. And today, as mentioned, we are starting off with warning signs. So getting straight into it, what are we going to be learning about today? Firstly, what are the general warning signs for mental illness in students? How do you identify these warning signs? And then we go into the most common mental illnesses in teenage girls and the specific signs then for anxiety, depression, ADHD, conduct disorder, and eating disorders. So what does today look like? At an overview, we're going to go through those general signs. How do you spot and identify those signs? Looking then at, as I mentioned, anxiety, depression, ADHD, conduct disorder, and eating disorders. As a reminder, here's an overview of how we define Maximinds mental health versus mental illness. And just want you to have this in the back of your mind, because at a high level, obviously we're looking at how to spot the tendencies on the right-hand side, which is what does a mental illness feel like and look like for a child and a student, as opposed to being mentally healthy, which is where we obviously want to get them to. So we're focusing today on the mental illness side, and your role is crucial. And I want to point this out for a number of reasons, because you as teachers have a fundamental role in being in the classroom on the ground with students every day, which is a huge advantage. And I'll tell you a few reasons. Firstly, you can help detect those early signs of potential issues. It doesn't mean you necessarily need to manage and treat them, but just helping to detect them is key so that they can then access the early interventions and support they need. It obviously also helps protect you as a teacher, but also your students, not only the student that is potentially suffering, but the students also in the classroom. It will also help your students to thrive in their academics. And that's obviously advantageous for you as teachers, because it can take away those extra challenges and complexities they have, which may be caused from things such as mental illness. And overall, you've got the oversight and visibility, which means you can gauge particularly what looks typical for a student, say in year 11, compared to another student, another girl in that same class or in that same year level. And you've got that oversight, so then you can help assess what is considered typical versus atypical. And we'll talk about why that's so important, because it is really about looking for comparisons. So to start with, looking at the general signs for mental illness. So what are warning signs and how do we define them? So they're indicators or cues that suggest the potential problem or an issue. They're observable patterns or changes in their behaviour, emotions or well-being that may signify these underlying difficulties. So a few things to call out here is that they're obviously indicators or cues, and we'll talk about what these look like. Also that they're observable either patterns or changes. So patterns mean almost within the student, what does the pattern look like for them and their personality and what they're like, but also their changes over time and how they've changed even between terms or whether it be even between years. So there is a huge long list of warning signs, and I've got a few categories up here as an overview, and we'll talk about what they each mean. These are at a high level based off what we've already talked about and explored in terms of how do we look for and define mental illness. So overview is mood. We're looking at their concentration in class, their energy levels, socials, their academics and performance, eating and exercise, particularly if you're on lunchtime duty, for example, or a PE teacher, but also maybe potentially a pastoral tutor, physical, their risk-taking, and what does that look like even at school, how overwhelmed they are, their sense of self-esteem, and also their motivation. This is obviously not a complete list, and there are many indicators, but we've tried to reduce them down to as few as possible. And what do these specifically look like? So this is probably an important slide to have at a really high level. What do these all each look like? So for mood, we're talking about emotional instability, mood swings, irritability, sensitivity. So you might find that they've got that shorter, maybe temper or emotional regulation when something's happening. You might notice that they're, say, tearing up, or that they're getting a bit snappier, say, with their friends or peers in class. In terms of concentration, they may struggle to focus, make decisions, and also become more forgetful. So this obviously is more aligned to something like ADHD typically. However, this can also happen in the case of, for example, anxiety and depression. Energy levels, we can't assess obviously how much sleep they're getting, although you can obviously ask them, but more so, are you noticing, are they fatigued? Are they tired? Do they appear almost in a daze or zoned out, and they haven't almost got enough sleep, but also are they carrying that huge amount of emotional load, which can also be really exhausting? So it's not always just about not getting enough sleep. In terms of social, you may notice they're withdrawing or becoming more isolated. They may change friends often, frequently, so that instability, or they may start to have fewer friends. You might find that they're spending more time, for example, in the bathrooms at lunch and recess rather than with their friends in the playground. For academics, this concerns persistent decline in academics, not necessarily if they are typically more of a lower marks-wise student, but more of a change again within themselves. Missing deadlines, not completing homework, that might also be, being late to class, or not showing up, for example. But that's, I think, obviously your key role there in terms of the academics, is making sure that they're doing all the work that they can, and you've got the greatest oversight there. Eating and exercising, and again, this may not apply to everyone, but even at a high level, and it's more of those extremes. So having more or less quite drastically, or not at all eating, or eating all the time, or not at all exercising, or exercising all the time, and they can all indicate very different mental illnesses, as we'll explore. So for instance, they may not be eating a lot if they've got, for example, an eating disorder, but they could be eating a lot of the time if they've got, say, a binge eating disorder as opposed to anorexia or bulimia. So there's still nuances in that. So again, we're looking for more changes and that extremes of what they might be doing. In terms of physical, they may be reporting things like headaches or stomach aches, or going to the infirmary a lot, or just absent from class and school due to illness, which we do know there's a big link between physical and mental illness. And as we explored even in the last few weeks, there are quite a lot of physiological symptoms that come with different mental illnesses. For instance, even for anxiety, things like IBS, so irritable bowel syndrome, which is clearly quite a physical symptom, but underlying that is caused by things potentially like stress and anxiety. Also, going to the infirmary potentially is that avoidant behaviour. Are they being too overwhelmed and overloaded in class, and they just need that minute to themselves? But that sort of thing. Risk taking, and how does this apply at school? Obviously, you don't have oversight of things like drugs and alcohol, but if you can even see if they're becoming, increasingly disruptive, are they rude? Are they vaping at school in the toilets? Those sorts of things. Just keeping an eye on that earlier stage of risk taking, which can develop into things such as conduct disorder, but also just reflect a general mental illness. Do you notice that they're overwhelmed, constantly worried, stressed, or finding that the workload's too much? You might again see that the shakiness or any sorts of physiological symptoms that come with anxiety or stress typically here, the ones that we've explored already, and we'll have another look at again today in relation to anxiety. Esteem, negative self-talk, constant self-criticism, even not putting their hand up or contributing in class, not wanting to engage. That can reflect things like self-consciousness, which, as we looked at, has a role to play in things like eating disorders last week, but also can reflect depression. And finally, motivation. So they may have less regard for work and then like a sudden loss of motivation. They might be really tardy with class and homework and just show that general lack of interest and disinterest. And we did explore this last week in terms of depression, the lack of interest, particularly for no longer having pleasure or seeking activities that they used to like. So, for example, a student that really used to like netball and they suddenly don't want to go and don't want to play at all, those sorts of things can definitely reflect things like depression. So that sounds like potentially a general teenager. So to give you specifics in terms of, well, any student could look like that at any one time. The key things we're looking for are, as I mentioned, changes. So different patterns or behaviours or personalities than prior. So particularly for them, so within that student, what has changed? So it's tricky to see, particularly if you see them every day or every week, but how can you almost take a step back sometimes at the end of each term maybe, or when you're doing the reports, or use some sort of marker throughout the year to then think, oh, okay, this is where they were and this is where they are now, even as a human rather than just academics, and looking at that as an overall. Then for atypical, I mentioned this as well, and this is why your role is so crucial, because you have the honour, I guess, of being exposed to all these students in a group every day and every week. So this is more the between peer comparison. So looking at, well, what would be typically expected of a year 8 student, for example, showing up then with their sporting activities, being always on time. If that's typical, and that's in the sort of the normal range, then what happens if you recognise that a student may not do those sort of same sorts of things repeatedly, or to be a change from their previous behaviour? So you're looking at both within them, some sort of change, but also differences between the peers. And then the other part is, of course, we're looking for impact, and we've talked about this clinically significant distress, which is that it impairs both a school and or home life. That can be trickier to gauge, and we can talk about how that can be, but these are the key things that we're looking at. It's not just in isolation necessarily at school. So to go back to actually what we have covered last week, I did want to bring up that causes clinically significant distress, and so it must interfere with their life functioning. It's not just because they don't like, for example, science, and therefore they don't bring all their textbook every day. It's almost got to be that they're also forgetting things at home, or they're having that disregard at home, that they just don't care anymore about school, or even between classes. So again, another really big advantage of you being teachers in an environment where you've got oversight across students who might have different subjects, therefore different teachers to collaborate with. Another reminder that mental illnesses are enduring. So you may see these things happen, for example, after a death of a family member, or a point in time when they've had something go wrong, and that would be not necessarily a mental illness, that would be a disruptive time of their life where they're exhibiting potentially mentally ill symptoms, but mental illnesses and disorders must be enduring over time. Must be professionally diagnosed, as we mentioned, not Google or say on TikTok, and more than just that naughty, inappropriate, or socially deviant behaviour, although we can look at how that's reflective of conduct disorder. So how do you actually identify all this? So in terms of identifying signs for mental illness, we're going to look at a couple of particular strategies that we use as psychologists, and that we're trained in to help you at a very high level pick up some of these. So to start with, would like you to look at your students by being hyper observant. And what is being hyper observant, having hyper observation? So this is someone that's obviously able to scan their surroundings and attend to things in quite heavy detail. They're able to attend to what's happening, and in this case, being very aware of your student. It's really about getting to know your student and knowing also who they were even a term ago, let alone a year ago, so that you can, one, spot those changes that may have happened, but also see how they may be reflective more of personality traits rather than necessarily mental illness disorders. So we will look at this in more detail next week when we do talk about strengths, interests, and values. But that's that in terms of getting to know them really as people. But that's something just to keep in mind. And I guess, why is this important? Because it's going to help you spot when something's different or unusual. And that's what the key thing is looking for the changes particularly. Another technique that I have introduced very briefly in the introductory session was this map, which is the basis of cognitive behavior therapy, which again is what we use as psychologists. So it's the interaction between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So as teachers, you can typically see their behaviors. And we've already explored a lot about what are the mental illness symptoms according to a child or a student. And so they sit more in the thoughts and feelings. But as much as possible, it's about helping you to identify the behaviors, the observed behaviors that you can see. So this is the way to think about empathy, another concept, I guess, as part of being a psychologist, which is if you can empathize with someone, you can observe what they do, say, think, and then feel. And you almost think of about that as a hierarchy. So it's not necessarily, you can empathize and see what they do and get some empathy, but ultimately it's getting to that feeling of how they're actually feeling underneath the surface. As I just mentioned, you as teachers have the benefit of being able to definitely observe what they do and also hear what they say. And that's somewhere to start in terms of how can we attend to their behaviours. The trick will be to how to keep moving across so that we can not only observe and look at those warning signs in terms of what they're doing and saying, but also then inferring what they're thinking and feeling. As mentioned, this is what a psychologist does, so it's not the role of you as a teacher, but it gives you some overview of where I'm going to help focus your attention and abilities, which is more of observing to what you can observe from visually from that and that do and say. So you're probably all familiar with the 7-38-55 rule, and if not, this is developed by a psychologist, and he actually in the 70s, and he came up with this division of that when people communicate their feelings, emotions, and also attitudes, their communication is made up of these three factors. So 7% is the verbal, so what they say, and vocal is made up of 38%, so quite a significantly bigger chunk, and vocal meaning pitch and tone, and how they communicate, and then also facial making up 55%. Beyond facial, I think it's also the body gestures and their movements, but the key point here being that the how and how is much more important than what they say, and the non-verbal is obviously much more indicative than about their feelings and emotions than just their verbal alone, which goes to why that hyper observation is so important, because often they might say things like, yeah, I'm fine, it's all good, but of course in your gut that something's not quite right, or it doesn't really feel like they're just okay. So at this point, I'd probably call out that always trust your gut, because that's there for a reason. I do think in those situations when people and children say everything's fine, if their, for example, body language is saying, is looking down, or they're shaking, or they say in a stern voice, or a bit more sharply and then not looking at you in the eye, of course, that's more indicative of something underlying that potentially. So to reiterate what we just looked at before, what we're attending to is changes, so different patterns of behaviours or personalities than prior. What is considered atypical or typical, so attending to how is this different to their peers. And in the home life, if possible, and not to overload you, it doesn't have to be necessarily outside of the classroom where possible, but using even your time with the students to just know what's happening at home at a high level. You know, are the parents going through, for instance, a divorce? Is there financial troubles going on? Is there someone that's unwell in the family? So just keeping that in mind as to what specifically we're looking out for. And so narrowing in terms of mental illness, as mentioned before, this is how we define it, about being not in the present, but in the past and the future, not having a sense of control, but feeling more helpless, and not being necessarily in touch with reality, but having that more delusional or not quite in touch with what's actually happening perspective. Why I'm bringing this up again is because I want to segue into what are the mental illnesses that are relevant that we're going to talk about, and how do we actually spot beyond this quite high level or theoretical, what actually those things to look out for in specific illnesses. So as we explored already, there's many different illnesses. I've got the ones up here that are most common in young people, but of course most common in teenage girls in Australia are anxiety, which is about 27%, depression, about 19%, ADHD, estimated to be about 9%, conduct disorder about 6%, and eating disorders about 6% on record. But the ones that I would say are definitely on the rise, and particularly for King Coppelrose Bay students, are anxiety, ADHD, and eating disorders. That's very niche to you, and that's my general sense rather than stats, but they're the ones that I'm thinking are and knowing that are going up, particularly for your girls. So starting with the most common mental illness disorder amongst teenage girls, and that is anxiety. So to return to the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness Disorders, here is the criteria for generalized anxiety disorder. I've included this one because it's the most common of anxiety disorders and it really covers the broadest range. Of course, as a reminder, there's all of the different types of anxiety disorders, everything from post-traumatic stress to OCD, but this one at least is the most common and also it is the broadest. So looking again at the criteria, more days than not for at least 6 months, about a number of events, and a reminder that generalized anxiety disorder is about having a fear or apprehension for multiple different types of stimuli, such as work, school performance, or both. And they can typically flip between those different things. So students, you're looking for those that find it difficult to control the worry. Again, probably not something you might be able to detect yourself, but the things that you would be able to attend to is one of the items that you can see here, including restlessness or being keyed up or on edge, easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating, irritability, muscle tension, and or sleep disturbance. For a child, you only need to have one of those things for more days than not for at least 6 months. And a reminder, there's that same criteria for all of them that at the bottom, that it must create or cause clinically significant distress, which means impairment across multiple domains, not just at school, but also at home if they had a part-time job as well, for example. So to summarize for anxiety, what are the warning signs that you can look for in class? Main things here is the mood, that irritability that was mentioned, typically more sensitive than most to perhaps getting feedback on assessments or even in class. reacting more than their fellow peers. The concentration, struggle focusing, making decisions, and forgetfulness. Energy, so that tiredness, fatigue is also typical of those with anxiety because of the extra cognitive load that it takes to constantly be alert and hypervigilant to those different stimuli which are causing them anxiety. So that causes the energy levels to drop. Physical, appearing restless or on edge and tense muscles. So you may see them sort of clenching their fists and things like that. And finally, being overwhelmed. Obviously, quite an obvious marker for anxiety and or stress, but being worried, stressed, asking lots of questions, always wanting clarification, wanting things to be just so, to take away some of that uncertainty which is causing that anxiety. I'm also going to play for you and show you how you can use warning signs to almost elicit initial diagnosis or mini assessment of maybe how your students might be feeling, and then to be able to direct you to resources that will help you. So another way that you can also identify warning signs is by going onto Maximinds, going into Take Quizzes, and here you will see there's a range of different quizzes that you can take which help you map warning signs onto certain mental illness disorders. So to give you the example of anxious, you can click on Take the Quiz, go through some admin, and then here you'll be presented with a series of questions which ask you to identify whether these warning signs or behavioural indicators have been present in your student in the last 2 weeks. So for example, just to demonstrate, you would go through here, and as you'll see, these are all related to different warning signs that we've already spoken about for anxiety. Click Submit, and as you'll see here, it'll come up with a result saying that it appears your student has been experiencing a bit of anxiety this week. So we would suggest you retake the quiz in another few weeks, but in the meantime, you can go here to Manage Anxiety, which will direct you to tools that you can use with your student. So for example, my student is anxious. That's what we've just found. And here are certain strategies that can help you. So moving on to depression, the second most common form of mental illness disorder in teenage girls at almost 1 in 5. Returning to the DSM, you would have seen this criteria last week on major depressive disorder. Just to remind you and reiterate what those symptoms are and how we can interpret those as warning signs for you to look out for. A reminder that they must have one of the first 2 criteria, definitely. So having that depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, and or diminished interest or pleasure in all or most activities. And that we often see as a change going from something they used to enjoy, as I mentioned earlier, around something like netball. They used to really enjoy it and love that, and then suddenly changed to not wanting to do that. It might also be that they used to really love English and doing creative writing, or there was something they really thrived in, and then you suddenly notice that they just don't want to do any of that anymore, or don't have that motivation. In addition to one or both of those, they must have some of the following criteria. So weight loss when not dieting, or weight gain, the insomnia or hypersomnia, which you will not necessarily know about, but at school picking up those things like the tiredness and fatigue, psychomotor agitation or retardation, fatigue or loss of energy, so again speaks to that criteria around insomnia and hypersomnia, worthlessness or excessive inappropriate guilt, diminished ability to concentrate or think, or indecisiveness, and or recurrent thoughts of death. Must be clinically significant or impair multiple domains, and not be attributable to any other physiological effects. So to interpret that for you, the key things you're looking out for as teachers are mood. Again, the mood swings, irritability, may appear tearful. Concentration, struggle focusing, making decisions, and forgetfulness. The physical symptoms around psychomotor agitation or retardation, so they're either hypervigilant and buzzing around, or they're flatter. Energy, the fatigue, tiredness, again, that might appear as being dazed or zoned out. Eating and exercise may be more extreme or less so, particularly around the eating. Esteem, negative self-talk, or at least constantly criticising their work, noticing that they don't feel confident in the sorts of work they're submitting, assignments, assessments, and things like that. And that big one, the motivation, diminished interest or pleasure in activities or things that they used to like or be interested by, whether that be subjects or outside extracurricular activities. Again, I will show you how you can apply this online to help almost assess students in your class. So further to what we just explored before regarding the anxious quiz, you can do the same with down. So again, you'd click take the quiz for down. Takes 45 seconds. As you can see, more warning signs or behavioural indicators that you can click through and see how often did your student not engage in activities. You would go through and click these, tearful, etc. Click submit. And in this case, it would give you the result that it appears your student has been feeling quite down this week. And we would suggest in this case that you would refer them to a psychologist. And you can do that by again clicking the link and being referred to a page which will give you a link to refer students to, but also answer some common questions that we get from teachers as to how to you refer a student to a psychologist. Do you need to speak to their parents? Should you bring it up with them? And etc. And then you would go back to this link and you can refer them to here to make an appointment. So further to moving on to ADHD, or attention deficit and hyperactive disorder. A reminder from last week that ADHD involves one or both of the subtypes regarding inattention and or hyperactivity and impulsivity. So they may have ADHD and be inattentive, or they may have ADHD and be more hyperactive and on the go, or they may have both. So in terms of the specific criteria and therefore warning signs that we're looking out for as teachers, it would be having 6 or more of the following symptoms for at least 6 months. And again, they must directly impact their social and or academic and occupational activities, so that clinically significant distress. So of the 6 symptoms, they could have a failure to give close attention to details or make careless mistakes, difficulty sustaining attention in tasks, does not seem to listen when spoken to directly, does not follow through on instructions, difficulty organising tasks and activities, reluctant to engage in tasks that require sustained mental effort, loses things necessary for tasks or activities, easily distracted by extraneous stimuli, and or potentially forgetful in daily activities. So of those criteria, 6 have to be present in the last 6 months in order to have a diagnosis of ADHD with the inattentive subtype. On the other hand, or as well as that subtype, there is the hyperactive and impulsive subtype. Same principles apply in terms of having to have 6 of the symptoms in the last 6 months, which have a direct impact not only on their schoolwork, but also outside, either at home and or in a job that they may have. So for these, for having more hyperactive tendencies, would be fidgeting or playing with hands or feet, squirming the seat, leaving the seat, running about or climbing things, unable to play or engage in leisure activities quietly, more on the go, driven by motor. They may talk excessively, blurt out answers before a question's been completed, have more difficulty waiting their turn, and interrupts or intrudes on others. So a reminder that they could have both the left-hand side and the right-hand side, or one of them, either or. Regardless, and this is important with ADHD, is that it has to be present before the age of 12. So that means, given your high school teachers, predominantly, they would have also had to have these symptoms in junior school. So without a diagnosis, we can't get a diagnosis without consulting typically junior school teachers as well, and understanding what they were like previously to being now in high school. And they must be present in the 2 or more settings, as we spoke about that clinically significant distress. To summarise here, and I've just grouped them together for now, but as hopefully it's clear about those different subtypes, but overall the things you're looking for with ADHD are those, particularly for the inattention, is the concentration. So it's struggle to focus, making decisions, forgetfulness, being distracted and inattentive. More so than for the hyperactive or impulsive are these physical symptoms. So the restlessness, running about, climbing, hard to sit still, leaving the seat, distracted by the surrounds, fidgeting. And then for both of them, they can have that social aspect, that poor listening, talking excessively, blurting out answers, failure to follow instructions. In terms of how we diagnose, as you'll see here, and we spoke about this last week, because firstly they have to have it, the clinically significant distress has to happen in multiple different domains. We assess it by getting, yes, their own self-report of how they feel they're going with these sorts of symptoms, but also a parent and a teacher, so that we can assess what's happening across the board. You'll also see, if you can see closely, that first one for self indicates how they like from 5 to 12. And typically it's a bit harder for children to self-diagnose on that, or even high school students. So the parents really come into that to help understand what they were like in junior school. And what I would often do, more your psychologists, is ask junior school teachers to also supplement what happens there. So that's the collective diagnosis that we get to, but that gives you at least some indication of what ADHD is looking like, and how you can start attending to those warning signs. And the next most common mental illness disorder is conduct disorder. As I mentioned last week, I don't anticipate this would be very prevalent in Kincoppal Rose Bay girls. However, for your own insight and awareness, these are the criteria according to the DSM. So at least 3 of any of the following 15 criteria in the last 12 months. So as you can see, there's some categories around aggression, destruction, deceitfulness and violation of rules. To that point, these are the things we are looking for. Bullies, threatens or intimidates others, initiates physical fights, uses weapons, cruel to people, cruel to animals, stolen while confronting a victim, force someone to a sexual activity, engaged in fire setting, destroys other properties, broken into someone else's house, lies to obtain goods, stolen items, stays out late at night, runs away from home, and truants from school. So that last one, I guess, is one criteria that's definitely more relevant to seeing how you can look out for that. But how that also applies to you at school, to give you some examples. The 3 main categories of the warning signs here would be around social, risk-taking and academics. So in terms of social, you would notice more conflict in a child that had conduct disorder, given their bullying, threatening, intimidating peers and friends, engaging in those physical fights in the playgrounds and physically cruel. Really not sure that would happen at Kincoppal, but you may have seen it. So this could give you some answers for that. Risk-taking, destroying property, particularly friends or peers. So this might be, breaking their pens and pencils or throwing around laptops, things like that. Breaking into others' lockers. So breaking in that, invasion of privacy, lighting fires, perhaps in the playground. In terms of academics, truants from school. So that's something that's relevant. Associated with that would be, given this sort of general type of behaviours that we're saying, by extension of that, and that this disorder, you might see persistent decline of academics, missing deadlines, not completing work, but it would come out as quite aggressive and a total disrespect and aversion to schooling. Similarly to ADHD, how we diagnose it is getting an assessment according to the self, parent, and teacher, because I think collectively that's really important, and we know it's important from a diagnostical perspective that you have to have that clinically significant distress across multiple domains. So that's the similar way we do that. And lastly, but not leastly, and as I think one of the fastest growing mental illnesses, particularly in teenage girls, is eating disorders. As we explored last week, there's 3 different types, but the vast majority of those with eating disorders, over 80%, have a binge eating disorder. So as a reminder, this is associated with recurrent episodes of binge eating, which happen the eating happens in a discrete period of time. There's a lack of control over the eating and must have 3 or more of the following. So rapid eating, feeling uncomfortably full, not actually feeling hungry, eating alone, disgusted with themselves, and marked distress. And it must happen at least once a week for 3 months at a minimum. So how do you look out for that as warning signs? From a social perspective, eating alone, typically girls with eating disorders would eat, if at all, in the bathroom by themselves or away from the playground. And so that draws that social withdrawal and isolation. Then they have potentially fewer and less friends. In terms of physical, this might not be as obvious as you think, given it's, as we've looked at, binge eating disorder is much more common than, for example, anorexia and bulimia, when we feel when it tends to be more obvious around their physical appearance. However, you would still see some sort of change in body physique, more of a concern with appearance. And we spoke about this last week, which is wearing more makeup, for example, because of that more hypervigilant focus on what they look like. Another clear one, again, as we looked at last week, is self-esteem and confidence. So we saw in that criteria disgusted with themselves, whether you can pick that, but it's that typically around that eating after and coming up after lunch and things like that. Negative self-talk, you may still experience this in the classroom, the criticism, not wanting to contribute because of those confidence challenges. So that takes us to the end of today's webinar. So to summarise, what did we learn about today? Warning signs involve a range of behavioural characteristics. There are observable patterns or changes in students' behaviour, emotions, or well-being. They include behaviours relating to, but not limited to, mood, concentration, energy, social, academics, eating and exercise, risk-taking, esteem, motivation, and many more. Warning signs are identified by attending to changes, particularly within the individual and within the student compared to previously, but also atypical behaviour when compared to between students or between their peers, and their impact on both school and home, and work if they've also got an outside job. In anxiety, warning signs concern mood, concentration, energy, physical, and appearing overwhelmed. In depression, they relate to, again, mood, concentration, physical, energy, but also eating, esteem, and motivation symptoms. In ADHD, they concern concentration, particularly in the inattention subtype, physical, particularly in the hyperactive or impulsive subtype, and or social for both. In conduct disorder, they relate to social, risk-taking, and academics. Particularly that risk-taking is very pertinent in conduct disorder. And in eating disorders, concern social, physical, esteem, and obviously eating and exercise changes. I would like to please ask you to scan the QR code. We didn't do the pre-quiz, just wanted to get your sense of how today's webinar hopefully helped, and if it didn't, any feedback, any other questions, just so that we can continue to evolve these and make these webinars better for you. So if you please wouldn't mind us answering a couple of questions, I'll just give you 20 seconds. Thank you. Finally, resources, as always, emergency contacts if you need them. Maximinds is always there 24/7. You've got the 3-month free trial, so please go on and particularly look at those quizzes, which we looked at today, to help you with warning signs and identifying those, and also what they actually mean and the level of severity of the mental illness to then help you and your students. And as always, I'm available to be contacted. Please reach out if you would like to, any questions, any further feedback, and look forward to seeing you again next week.